hit the button. Fantastic. Great. Um, and then I should also say that the next talk in the Superstudio Talk series is next week, November 6th at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and it's Karen Kuby from University of Toronto presenting a talk, if I remember correctly. Um, the title is Architecture and the Right to Housing. So please join us for that. It will be fantastic. So I should also say that I'm currently in my office at the University of British Columbia, which is on the traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. So with that, I will then share my screen and get going here. Let's see. Okay, and I have the task of letting people into the into the room as I go. Whoops. All right. Bear with me, wearing multiple hats. Okay. So, thanks so much for coming. I really appreciate you spending time with me this afternoon. I hope you find the things I'm going to talk about interesting and stimulating. And I look forward to a discussion afterwards. So, the talk is just titled, Architecture and Financialization, or Financialization and Architecture. I've been interested in this topic for quite a while and have written a fair amount about it, and I'm going to share some of my thoughts with you today. First, I just want to kind of frame today's presentation with a very basic understanding, or kind of, let's call it, lens to think of buildings architecture through. Of course, there's many competing ways to conceptualize buildings' role in our society, in our culture. And I would offer this one as one that I think is um, very simple, very elemental, and helps us understand some changes that occur to buildings across culture, time, economic systems, so on and so forth. And this is simply that every single building um, has to simultaneously satisfy three basic elemental functions, right? So every building somehow provides a sheltering role, right? Protects from the temperature, snow, sun, so on and so forth. At the very same moment, every building, of course, satisfies what we can call a kind of cultural role. So it embodies, it physicalizes, it makes possible ideas about social relations, aesthetic preferences, symbolism, so on and so forth. At the very same time, it by necessity serves a wealth function, right? A kind of storage of wealth, a location of wealth, a marker of wealth. And that's by the very simple necessity that every building takes labor to design, to construct, and to maintain. The materials have to be sourced, moved, so on and so forth. So no matter if a building is a simple shed or a museum, it provides all of these roles simultaneously. But then, of course, we all know that through different cultures, through different moments in history, through different functions, programs, the kind of relationship between the sort of shelter, culture, and wealth function shifts. It's dynamic. It's not constant, right? So there's certain points in history we could say, you know what, like the cultural dimension of the building is configuring its design, its use, its performance a little more than the wealth function. Or in a certain setting and programmatic contents, like shelters driving things a little bit more overtly than the culture and wealth. So these things are dynamic and change. And I'm interested in how they change and why they change. So I'm going to start with a kind of brief story. Um, And this story is largely a story that Robin Evans, the British architectural historian, told. And in this very, I think, important and influential essay that came out in 1978, Figures, Doors, and Passages. And, Robin Evans' task in this essay was to kind of talk about domestic architecture, right? So he was obsessed with the floor plans of homes, right? And how those floor plans changed through history. And for him, Robin Evans was really interested in Western floor plans, a very Eurocentric historical tale, and how they shifted over time, very literally around doors, the number of doors, the placement of doors, and how figures, human bodies, moved between these different doors and rooms, right? And I'm going to kind of paraphrase this essay, and he looks at plans of buildings and other visual cultural material to kind of make sense of them. And so basically, one of the images that shows up quite early in his story is this painting by Raphael, right? A high Renaissance painting from 1514. And he's very interested in how it shows human bodies in space. He's very simply, and he just uses this as, among other paintings, to show what is kind of paradigmatic of showing bodies in space at this time. And the bodies, he's like, it's very interesting compared to other historical periods. The bodies are very close together. They are often like they're touching each other. They are often disclosed or unrobed. So there's a kind of writhing, um, carnal, almost bodily proximity that is shown across many paintings. And he's like, interestingly, at the same time, the floor plans, and these in his essay really are floor plans of wealthy people, right? Um, and and here is a kind of relatively contemporary floor plan to the painting we just saw of Raphael by Palladio, of course, the kind of master Renaissance architect in Udine. And and Robin Evans is fascinated by, he's like, wow, there is no other than the stair, there really is no designated circulation space. The passage does not exist, right? What you have is a series of rooms of which to move between them, you must go from room to room. Sorry, I'm trying to allow people into the talk while trying to move the images. Um, and so for Evans, this is like, wow, that makes sense with the way bodies are painted at the time, right? There is no idea, a modern idea of privacy yet. And he, Robin Evans goes to great pains to say this is an incredibly sophisticated society. It wasn't that they couldn't think of hallways and passages. Of course they could. They deliberately decide that it's something they don't need, that it is societally normal and acceptable to move from room to room to room and find oneself kind of experiencing the programmatic social phenomena that just happen to be there, right? So this is the entangled, very bodily kind of carnal house, I would say, right? And then interestingly, he's like, huh, a number of centuries pass in Europe, and of course, painting changes a lot. And, we arrive, it's a slow transformation. It moves this kind of historical tale a little differently in Germany than it does in England or in Italy. But zoomed out far enough, this change happens across all of Europe. And bodies are portrayed pictorially very different. So this is William Morris, a very famous painting that he did in 1858. And here you see the isolated body. There's two figures in this painting. Another figure is far at the back. There's a great distance between them. And there's none of that kind of proximity. And not only this, the bodies that are shown, it's very hard compared to the Raphael painting to make out their contours. They're concealed in shrouds of fabric, right? this sort of 19th century portrayal of the isolated, separated, concealed body, very different from the naked, entangled Renaissance body. And, Robin Evans is like, when you look at, again, homes for rich people at this time, they are obsessed with passages, with hallways, right? So this is the very influential and important Red House, co-designed by Philip Webb and William Morris, the ground floor on the left, the upper floor on the right. And here, each room has its individual door, right? There's only one access point compared to the Palladian with each room multiple doors. To move between them, you have to go into a designated circulation space. So this massive change, right? Massive, massive change from the carnal plan to the kind of passageway plan, the separate body plan. Now, why might this happen, right? I think there's many theories. Robin Evans is very explicit that in this time, there is the emergence, the time between the carnal plan and the passageway plan, there is the emergence of a modern idea of privacy, right? That it would be improper to like just stumble into a room, into whatever was happening there. That there's something about human behavior that to be a kind of full human is to have private space, to have one's privacy. And you can connect the emergence of this idea to many different things, but one is the kind of philosophical writing and writing around politics that happens in the intervening period between those early floor plans and the 19th century floor plans. So, for instance, John Locke in 1690, kind of early, early in this narrative of transformation, wrote very influential writing around governmentality and kind of politics and the social compact, right? And one of the things that he was very interested in is this idea of how an individual owns themselves and owns their labor and owns their space. So, for instance, though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man be in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Now, interestingly, for Locke, the privateness of the body and the privateness of the labor meant that the private body could act on the common land and transform it into private property. So I think it's very important that in the move from the carnal matrix plan to the private space passage plan, not only are people like Locke writing about privacy, they are writing about the idea of private property as something separate from the commons. So this is a very kind of well-known painting from England by Thomas Gainsborough in 1750 called Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. And they are standing here. Mr. Andrews is armed. Mrs. Andrews is in this kind of cloaked, hidden body outfit. And they are on their land that they have transformed through their labor into their private property. The fence that closes it off. So my point here is that as the passageway plan emerges, there is also the invention of the enclosure system in England and continental Europe to physically separate the common land into private parcels that were controlled by specific property owners. So it was about a fragmentation of ownership of the previously commonly held a commonly used landscape. And so I think the change to this is in concert with the change of the landscape into these isolated parcels. So um, now, so essentially what I'm saying is that the emergence of modern private property goes hand in hand with the emergence of privacy and the necessity to separate people in the domestic sphere. Now, that is like my synopsis of the dominant thread of Robin Evans' tale. Robin Evans doesn't talk about enclosure. He doesn't talk about the emergence of private property, but I think he's just on the verge of that in his writing. And I've kind of editorially, let's say, added that in our discussion today. So, so financialization. So I'm kind of interested in how you go from this and this to this, right? So if this is the private body, the passageway body, this is an image, in this case, of it's a rendering used in the marketing campaign for Raphael Vignoli's pencil tower in Midtown Manhattan on what is called Billionaires Row of the woman's, you know, ensuite master bathroom. And this image is, let's say, iconic of a whole series of images that are very like this. There is when you look at the marketing of supposedly luxury real estate, the standalone tub directly adjacent to a large window is a kind of trope. There's a kind of obsession of it. And this is one of the kind of the kind of peak zenith images of that obsession. And so I would say, interestingly, like the body is now right. So if we like follow this arc, the entangled Raphaelite bodies to the kind of isolated Morris body to the body of finance capitalism is evacuated, right? So this bathroom sits inside high up in this tower, right? This is an elevation of the tower. I mean, kind of in the history of architecture, I think, an astounding elevation, right? So it's at the time, like one of the thinnest buildings, inhabitable buildings ever made for long-term inhabitation. Its slenderness ratio. Each of its four sides is absolutely identical. It's a pure square in plan. There is an obsession with the square, like all of the windows we're seeing, right? Absolutely purely isometric, same in all dimensions. It has Manhattan's famous for towers that, of course, taper or wedding cake step back, have some sort of termination at the sky. This is something that you could flip upside down and it would be essentially exactly the same. It's almost omnidirectional. In fact, Raphael Vignoli, when he was describing the logic of this project, described it as a constant object, which is quite interesting in terms of like omnidirectionality and omnipresence. This is a sample floor plan, right? So if you remember the Palladian floor plan, and this is, I think, an indicative spatial configuration of finance capitalism, right? High, high in the sky, um, a series of, elevators that deposit you in what is called a private elevator landing. There is no shared circulation, in fact, right? There's no shared hallway because you don't need that in this kind of version of luxury because the entire unit spans the entire floor. Um, Emerge into an entrance gallery, and then the ability to kind of move around the core into a series of kind of living spaces, library spaces, and then bedroom spaces. Back right here is that bathtub, the photograph was looking out or the rendering looking out this way. So a kind of, I would say, a hyper post-social type of architecture. And I think it's not insignificant that, of course, these things are constructed in the centers of cities, right? And they're kind of anti-city isolation chambers. So if I talked about the enclosure acts in England and continental Europe and the emergence of modern capitalistic private property as being key to the William Morris floor plan, my argument is that the floor plan logics and the rendering logics and the proportional logics of a building like this are very much to do with a change, a continuation in the logic of capitalism's development, right, that happens between the 19th century and our time. Different thinkers, economists, sociologists, describe this transformation in capitalism towards financialization, finance capitalism. Let's also remember in our conversation, there is no capitalism. There are capitalisms. It's very plural. What's capitalism in China now is very different than capitalism in 17th century England. There's agricultural capitalism, consumer capitalism. This I'm very much interested in finance capitalism. This is a representation of the Greek economist's idea. His name is Kostas Lapavitsis, and he says that actually there's been two periods in the history of capitalism that we could call periods of financial ascendancy. The first happens from the late 19th century to around 1930. And then from 1930 to 1980, there's not actually a significant change in terms of finance capitalism's role in capital, right? And that's interesting because of what happens after the Great Depression, FDR, the New Deal, and there's a kind of reorganization of how capital works in modern democracies. And Thomas Piketty writes a lot about that, right? Like Thomas Piketty in his book Capital, he's like, capital is inherently something, capitalism, that moves towards inequality. And he's like, it always has been doing that, except in this period, kind of like 1930, 1980, roughly, because of the sort of mechanisms of redistribution and kind of social rebalancing. But anyway, Lapavitsis and almost everybody that looks at financialization, of course, says around 1980, something significantly changes, right? And so that we are in, according to Lapavitsis, the second financial ascendancy. Now, there's lots of terms in the world that get used, overused, and they become nebulous and almost nothing. Sustainability, globalization. So maybe financialization is also at risk of this. So I want to just put one definition up here. So Greta R. Krippner is an American sociologist. She did a very influential study where she really, among other things, where she really tried to measure to see if there was something changing, in her case, the American economy that we could call financialization. She argues there is, and it can be measured. I'm going to read her definition. So a pattern of accumulation, right? Primarily, so not only, right, but primarily through financial channels rather than through trade and commodity production. So, of course, trade continues to happen, commodity production continues to happen. It's about a kind of a shifting to where capitalists make money. So, and then financial here refers to activities relating to the provision or transfer of liquid capital in expectation of future interest, dividends, or capital gains. This word liquid, I'm going to return to. I think it's really important. But to give you an example of this, like there was a time where American car companies would make almost all of their money by like they would build the cars in factories, right? And then they would sell those cars to car dealerships that would then sell the car, right? And so those car companies would make most of their money by the gap, the profit gap between how much it cost to make the car and how much they sold the car. So this is like classic industrial capitalism. As financialization occurs, car companies, they're like, our goal is to be as profitable as possible. Maybe there are some other ways we can profit out there. And maybe one of the ways is that we could get into the game of car loans. If we we could charge we'll make money on the capital gain or the profit gain between production and for sale cost, but we'll also start making money on the interest of all of these loans. And actually, this is what happens. Car companies get heavily involved into lending money and receiving the interest payments on this. Now, this is just one example. of an industrial capitalist entity moving towards a financial capitalist entity. But this happens across the entire economy. And Greta, our Krippner, really measures this, right? Now, I think this has massive impacts for architecture. So here, sorry, I'm trying to move this thing. This is if you add up the value of all the stock markets in the world in 1980, that's how much they're worth in the lower right. Now, 2000, this is 2018. This is a little out of date now, but if you continue it, it continues to grow. Through financialization, there is also a co-occurrence in which literally, and this is kind of so simple, but it's mind-boggling, the amount of money in the world radically explodes, right? There's a huge, and people look at this and they call it the giant pool of money or the great wall of money. And it can be measured in like all phenomena of what happens in global capitalism post 1980s in the era of financialization. Now, people have spoken about how this money, in the logic of investing it, so finance capitalism does some interesting things. It is in concert with the production of the capital, but then within a logic in which the capital must be reinvested at all times. But then the number of places to invest has a hard time, traditional places to invest, of keeping up with all the capital. So it means that huge amounts of the giant pool of money get funneled into things. And as it turns out, real estate is a massive place in which it gets funneled into. So when I talked about the recalibration between shelter, culture, and wealth, financialization's production of the giant pool of money means that an incredible amount of it goes into real estate and by extension buildings. And it literally changes how buildings are conceived, how they are almost kind of structurally asked to perform, and it mutates them in like an incredible number of ways, is my argument. So we could say that in really the post 1980s, there is an emergence of what advanced capitalist architecture. And I think in the broadest sense, it has a number of kind of characteristics that you can identify. One is that it is inherently unstable and creates spaces of crises, right? Because built into the logics of the absorption of the giant pool of money is a heightened tethering with financial markets on a very large scale. So it means that the systems of housing production, in this case, are more prone to overproductions and significant corrections. So this is an image, for instance, from Ireland of one of the famous ghost estates, right? Which I'm sure you're all aware of, which is that leading up to the 2007, 2008 financial crisis, huge amounts of global capital, that giant pool of money, was funneled into housing production in Ireland, and it became very uncoupled from reasonable metrics of local demand. And then, of course, at some moment, it was real. People realized this, and it was like, "Holy shit, we better stop building this. Oh my God, like, what are we going to do with this amount of overproduction?" And of course, there was everything stopped, and projects fell into disrepair, were not completed, and things were deconstructed, destroyed without even being inhabited in some cases. So this is one, but you can find this everywhere, right? Like and it's dynamic, right? So, if we went to this site now, it would be different. So it's always changing. But I mean, I've been in Northern Africa and Morocco, like unbelievable amounts of like empty structures, that come after these ones. And it sort of roves around the world, this kind of crises and sort of instant decay. And it's almost to the point so prevalent that it's a kind of characteristic of the system not working, but actually kind of working. It works this way. Um, so I would say this is part of like, so we could say buildings from their beginning, houses from their beginning, at least in the modern capitalist sense, for centuries have always been a place of wealth storage. So it's nothing new that we would be approaching them this way. But I think their role as speculative wealth storage is amplified in the era of finance capitalism. This is an amazing cross section of one of Iceberg or London's Iceberg homes. And there's a very compelling set of circumstances that makes these buildings happen. That is a kind of local intersection of heritage preservation rules, character preservation rules in certain neighborhoods of London that are at this very same moment very attractive for people, very wealthy people from around the world investing into them. And then the realization that none of the rules said anything about what you could or couldn't do underground, and then this kind of very emergent organic thing in which, well, let's let's literally build these huge spaces underground as um a way to like amplify the value of the property, value of the building, and store, very literally store wealth in the architecture, but also when you look at the program of what's often in these spaces, they're also kind of safety there, or let's call them like safes, you know. So you can sometimes there's car museums where the supercar collection, you know, with the like $1 million cars all parked, or gold storage. Um, Okay. And then of course, the built environment is always a place where inequality is made manifest. That is nothing new. But I think there's a kind of heightened, because also as the giant pool of money grows, the kind of metrics of like the OECD, for instance, in the Gini coefficient is that there also is a measurable increase in inequality. So you have in concert with the wealth storage, more and more kind of strange built manifestations of inequality as I think a key characteristic of finance capitalist architecture. And my friends in Vancouver will know this story very well, but I find it unbelievably fascinating, right? So like on the left is a photograph of a condominium interior of the kitchen of BRK Engel's Vancouver House project in downtown Vancouver. That kitchen island is a kind of simplified model of the entire building flipped on its side, because the building is famously a triangle at its base and a rectangle at its top. So the kitchen counter is a model of the whole building. Um, but everyone who bought a unit in this building directly funded the construction of one of these homes on the right. So each stair is to a house here. And these were homes for families in need in Phnom, quote in quotes, families in need in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. And the buyers on the left were given the opportunity to fly to Cambodia and hand the keys to these families. And it was part of the marketing campaign of Vancouver House that buyers could participate in the world's first one-to-one home gifting program, this kind of spatial philanthropy. It should be noted that in the marketing campaign, West Bank listed 20, the whole campaign was organized around 20 reasons to buy a property in Vancouver House. And it was called 20 Reasons to Buy a Piece of Living Sculpture, right? And the number one reason, literally, it was one word. It said super prime. So the number one, that's interesting for the number one reason. It's not that it's a beautiful thing. It's not that it has great views even, or a great place to raise a family. Super prime is a real estate term that actually comes into being in the post-1980s era. No one talked about super prime in 1950 or 1960. So the number one reason is that this is a really great, high-profile, prestigious investment. Number 15 or so was that you could participate in the World Home Gifting Program. In between were that there was an on-site fleet of BMWs. That's an interesting question, why a very rich buyer of a building would need an on-site fleet of BMWs, right? Like, and so, okay. Um, I do think that finance capitalist architecture has a simultaneous propensity for being highly iconic while being extremely standardized all at once, right? Um, you can point this out in like many different ways, and I'm kind of choosing well-known kind of zeniths of this to make the point. But on the right is Herzog and de Meuron's 56 Leonard, another condominium tower, very tall, very slender. On the left is one of the um, posters from its marketing campaign. And I think, it finds an iconicity in a very literal pixelization of a kind of it's it's almost like if we think of 432 Park, the earlier one by Raphael Vignoli, as a kind of isometric abstraction. It's like in this case that the isometric abstraction has this pixelated treatment to find a kind of way to be a distinguished icon all at once. But there's no, yeah, it is about this currency of iconicity at the same time as a kind of increment of abstract spatial investment, in my opinion. So the last thing, and this remember Greta Krippner's definition of financialization, that liquid capital was key to how the dividends and how the interest would accrue, is that finance capitalist architecture has a tendency to increase liquidity. I find this like super, super fascinating. Now, okay, what is liquidity, right? Liquidity, there's many sophisticated definitions. This is a pretty straightforward definition, just from Investopedia.com. I love Investopedia.com. What a great website. And so liquidity refers to the efficiency or ease with which an asset or security can be converted into ready cash without affecting its market price. The most liquid asset of all is cash itself, right? Now, one cool thing on Investopedia is they have little video tutorials to help you like make sense of this. This is the video. This is a screenshot from Investopedia's 2-minute long video on finance or liquidity. This course does what almost every description of liquidity does to help people understand. So like when I took like Econ 100, this is how it was taught. They say to help you understand liquidity, we're going to tell you what is not liquid. And our example of what's not liquid is going to be real estate. And then they show a building, right? So that's what they're doing in this video. So this is like, hey everyone, this is not liquid. And when you look at this, you're like, okay, looks like a single family home. It's got a front door that's visible from the ground. It's got some landscaping on it. It's got this sort of broken gabled roof, siding. There's a one-to-one relationship between envelope and ownership, and this is what's not liquid, right? So what I want to say then is like, and this is very obvious, is that we can understand liquidity on a spectrum, right? And that's a common way to understand it. So cash is liquid at one end, the most liquid thing, because when physical dollar, right, like a loonie, every loonie is the same. It's easily moved around. You can hand it off to people with no change in value instantaneously, right? Liquid, liquid, liquid. Whereas real estate is classically illiquid because it's big, immobile, and developers will always tell you historically, and when I took real estate development finance at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, all real estate is local. To be a good real estate developer, all real estate is local. And localness, though, is this idea of localness is exactly what makes it not liquid, right? Cash, there is no locality in cash, right? And when you talk to developers and read, I mean, I know this makes sense to all of you, right? But it's literally the fact that like every building is somehow different. made by different architects at a different point in time with different materiality. Each block is slightly different from the other. Each neighborhood is different. Each city is different. And to be a responsible investor, you must know about that. To be a responsible developer, you must know about that. And for most of capitalism's history, there is no easy way to find all of that information out. Noise, pollution, crime rates. What does it feel? What's the light like? And that was hugely time consuming, hugely illiquid, right? Now, we can place in between this spectrum stocks. They're not as liquid as cash, but they're pretty close. Paintings, less liquid than stocks, more closer to real estate, but much more liquid than real estate historically. Um, Financialization and all of that giant pool of money going into architecture, I argue, is trying to move the quintessentially illiquid thing of real estate down the spectrum to become more like cash. Of course, it can never do it, but it tries to do it because it serves the logics of financialization. Now, how do you do this? It's quite interesting, right? One thing is that you tether to real estate things that are more liquid. So financial investments, which are invented, they did not exist up until relatively recently, like are invented to be tethered to real estate. So you have the first real estate investment trusts, which is a legal invention, legal market invention, first in 1960, but it doesn't come into widespread use until the post-1980s era. Mortgage-backed securities are invented in the United States. They spread worldwide, 1968, but they don't come into widespread use until the post-1980s era. Of course, MBS played a huge role in the 2007, 2008 financial meltdown, but they did not go away. They still are a massive component of our global markets. So that's one way that you try to move it down the spectrum. But also, I think so those are financial inventions. There's legal inventions. So condominium laws, like condominium is a legal invention, right? And those did not exist prior to the 1960s. But again, so you start to see condominiums built with the legal strata designation in the 1960s, but it takes a while for them to take off, right? I think actually the post 1980s second ascendancy of financialization happens to be something that really occurs as condominiums as a tenure type takes off. Now, there's a really good property scholar at UBC named Doug Harris who's written about this. But he's like, so I mean, this is nuanced globally, right? Because there's different legal cultures in different places in the world. But if we take North America for a moment, up until condominium law, there is no way for any human being or any business to own an increment of space that is not connected to the ground, to directly connected to the ground. Condominium is the first thing that enables this, which is kind of trippy. And Douglas writes about this. He's like, you know, of course there are big, tall, multi-unit buildings in North America, but they're always predicated on ownership of the ground, right? Like, so you could be the owner of a 50-unit building and rent all of those units out, but that's about the ground. You could have a co-op, like in New York City, let's say, where this has a very rich, developed North American history, but you could live on the 20th floor in a unit, but you don't legally own the unit. You own shares in the co-op, and then you've used the space of the unit upon mutual agreement. So there's a kind of difference here. But the co-op structure in North America, it is the equity co-op, those co-ops in North America or in New York are equity co-ops, built into its ownership of shares and mutual agreement of use is a very slow thing about who can buy and sell. There's the interview process. It takes a very long time. That's not liquid. Condominiums law is all about liquidity. You are free as the fee simple owner of that thing on the 51st floor to buy and sell when you want to who you want. It's more liquid. So condominium laws radically increase liquidity. We take this for granted. It's a very simple thing, but like through most of history, there was not an easy way to kind of buy property in a place that you weren't, right? It's still not as easy as buying it right where you are, but it's way easier. So like in 1975, you start to see globalized real estate brokerages, right? And so now you can have a kind of brand continuity, like to buy something in Vancouver and Singapore and Amsterdam, and the process is much more streamlined and you have comparable information. That kind of localness is radically reduced through access to information. But then property technology in the 2000s kind of radically accelerates this, right? Um, and Airbnb is probably the most disruptive prop tech to date, but there is a whole raft of them, like Zillow in the United States, hugely, like on one hand, very simple, but also very powerful about access to information, efficiency, that therefore translates into liquidity and ease of transactions. So I want to say, and then at the center of this, there are changes to physical forms of buildings. So financialization, finance capitalist architecture is a complex ecology of legal transformations, financial transformations, business practice transformations, technology transformations, and form transformations, building form transformations. And in a way, not one is more important than the other, but they all need each other to so thoroughly change basically the world we live in. And so, these are like what I argue are five kind of archetypes of finance capitalist architecture, but they are archetypes. Like, so it's I think in icebergs, in ex-urban investment mats, in super podiums, and in ultra thin pencil towers, you can see more sharply what are common characteristics of finance capitalist architecture that you can find in more subtle and prevalent forms almost everywhere, right? And these are some photographs of interiors of London iceberg homes. There's very interesting, but of course, when you put things underground, there becomes a whole like language of lighting and illumination. Um, this is an ex-urban investment mat on the edge, ex-urban edge of Mexico City in an area called San Bonaventura. Kind of mind-boggling repetition of increments of home ownership. These are all duplexes that are like thousands of them, identical, except for slight changes in color and whatnot. But you all across Mexico, you can find these. And when you trace, as others have, like why they got built, who financed them, what's the logic? I mean, it's Wall Street investment firms directly like propelling this forward in a privatization of what was formerly social housing programs. And they don't work. And there's lots of literature on all of the ways in which they just don't make sense for human beings to live in. No transportation, no proximity to work, so on and so forth. Podiums are a weird thing. I mean, we've had podiums forever, right? As long as there was something you could put on a podium, they've existed. But it is interesting how in many places in the world in the post-1980s era, podium towers become a kind of popular thing. I think there's something about the separation from the ground and the manufacture of a kind of new privatized plane upon which towers of they're usually condominiums um, as increments of investment. So this is in Istanbul, Zorlu Center. This is in Miami. Like all of this pool, this huge like recreational landscape is all on top of a Brickell Center by Architectonica in downtown Miami, of which there's just podiums, 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 and like a new world up on the level. And then, of course, like, I mean, like Manhattan has a kind of unparalleled pencil tower phenomena, but the phenomena can be found in different degrees in many places in the world. I mean, this this is insane. Like 111 West 57th, it's the tallest sole residential. It's hard to keep up with all the designations, but it's like the tallest, I think, solely residential building in the world, and it only has 58 units. Like that's also great, you know? And of course, it's all the units are on one floor or two floors or three floors. Now, I think this going back to like Richard or Robin Evans and the kind of story about the bodies, I think you could say in this like making localness of real estate into actually something that is not local is a radical diminution of the importance and significance of the shelter and cultural function of buildings. Of course, there's still a sheltering function. Of course, there's still a culturing function, but it's very diminished. And I think that that is kind of you can find it in so many places. And I do think so. This is a photograph of a party in Toronto to launch the kind of pre-sale phase of a series of housing projects, right? A new kind of area, right? So the buildings don't exist, construction has not started. And this is to get all the people who are going to sell the buildings excited. And they use the renderings and the models for it. And I think this pre-sale assignment phenomena is so fascinating, right? In connection to the things that we've been talking about. That you can buy something from these folks. The thing that you will buy is the agreement to buy a building, a unit in a building when it is finished. And you were going to base that on the plans and the renderings, right? So you buy these pre-sale assignments years out, right? And then the really interesting thing is that then though those assignments can be sold back and forth and an autonomous market occurs, right? So that is when you think of the liquidity spectrum, right? I mean, I know we're all familiar with that they exist and they've existed for a while now, and it's weird, but they're kind of whatever, it's how we do things. Um, but in a kind of dematerialization, diminution of the importance of the human body and the presence, I think it's very significant. And, you know, leads to this kind of like hyper liquid immaterial thing. And I find it so fascinating right now because there was a time not that long ago where, you know, it pre-pandemic, um, but leading into the pandemic, where say in Canada, you know, the kind of intensity of the housing crisis, affordability crisis was coming to be seen in sharper relief. And there was all of these debates like, why is it happening? What do we need to do? And so many different positions. But there was often this thing about like, well, you know, like foreign investors, for example, they don't, it's not significant. They're a tiny component of the market. And I think there is evidence to support that argument, right? Um, but now it's kind of rules and regulations have changed, right? Canada has a national moratorium on foreign investors. And now we see this thing that like so like 6 years ago is like minor part, don't worry about it. There's other things. And now, like I just took a screen grab. This one was an easy one to get, but you can find like, you know, the Globe and Mail's full of these things. Like in BC, all the big developers just wrote an open letter to like Mark Carney and Ravi Kahlon and politicians saying, please, your moratorium and restrictions on foreign investors is screwing the whole housing market. And we need them to participate in this. And in absence of their presence, we can't get our project started. And so so it's like in the rhetoric, it's quite fascinating to me how quickly the tone and the positions change, right? So I think you have a clear declaration that from the leaders of the mainstream housing industry in recent months about how vital the mechanisms of financialization are to keeping the current system as it is. Premier EB is quite interesting how he's responded so far. He says, well, we're not going back. That model's flawed. And now we're in a kind of strange period where, it's a terrible model. It's led to all of these problems. But now we're in this kind of tricky moment of changing the way in which financialization has worked in a place like Canada, and we've not yet found exactly how things are moving forward. But of course, all of the logics of financialization at a kind of global scale are continuing unabated. Like prop tech innovations and uptake is just continuing. So like REITs are now starting to be more and more decentralized. So this is Fundrise, for example, which is, you all could just sign up right now. It would take not that long. Um, and then start investing on your phone $10, $5, $6 in real estate, right? In this kind of distributed real estate investment trusts at your hand. I think it is not insignificant if you're searching for a home in Canada now that many of the portrayals of your potential home will be virtually staged by AI software. So piecing all these things together, right? That is like, I don't know. I recently was in a process of getting a home, and like I'd say my experience was like 40%, 45% of the visualizations were AI stagings. Um, it is, I think, very interesting that so like Zillow I talked about has what's called Zestimate, and that is their automated valuation model that algorithmically values the properties that are for sale on its site. And automatic valuation models are being used on a massive scale around the world to appraise properties. And this has implications for sale prices. It has implications for insurance. It is not yet, we're not at the point like where the physical appraisals have completely gone away, but it's interesting to see how things are changing. And there is emerging literature stuff that like what is algorithmic legibility in housing. And there are arguments to be made that the algorithms are another thing that is moving housing to even more a kind of banal, dehumanized, standardized increment to make sense within its logics. It can't, the algorithms don't know how to understand something that's like super architecturally unique and like particular to a family with very unique desires, for instance, right? So this is all, I think, quite concerning. This, I think, has to do with the kind of twinning of the real world and a digital twin feedback loop that serves financialization. But the interesting thing, of course, the real world, the physical world continues to exist, of course, but it's being changed to suit these logics, right? So like people have written about how certain colors work better for the digital staging, and that has like looped back into how people want their actual homes to be painted, and like this idea of grage as the ultimate staging color, but then like your house is permanently staged. You live in it forever in the grage. Um, and then of course, like, these pencil towers, for instance, are laden with problems, right? Because it's almost their logics, I would argue, were so dematerialized, but yet they can't things can't move down the spectrum into pure digital cash, right? There still is something built in this whole thing. So I find fascinating the ongoing literature accumulating about all the ways in which these buildings don't really work. 432 Park has like a ton of cracks across it now. And it's really a big question. What are they going to do about this? They've found missing pieces of concrete that's like, where did that go? Like, so, um, and then of course, I mean, it's becoming also, I mean, some of the floor plans. I mean, Toronto, it's unbelievable, some of the floor plans. Like when you watch the videos of, sorry that this is so blurred, but, clearly the alienating plans of things that were formed on logics that didn't really have to do with where human beings were comfortable in their living environment. Right? So I'm going to end there. I've probably gone too long. but I think the ongoing logics of financialization have embedded within them a kind of structural move down that liquidity spectrum, and the liquidity spectrum is best served by things not being very local, and a kind of form of non-locality is in a way is to the human is no longer there. And then our lagging kind of physical presence and the gap between the desire of like the vanished financial body and our bodies is just creating all sorts of dysfunctional, weird, troubling, um, alienating conditions for all of us. So I'll stop there. Thanks for listening.
Matthew, do you want to take some questions?
Yes.
Okay, I'll start off, but others, if you have questions, please jump in. Either you can type them into the chat or raise your hand and we'll call on you. So given the talk, in this talk, you focused a little bit more on the prop tech than I've heard you talk about before. Are there any like positive examples of prop tech that's trying to subvert some of these systems? Is anybody doing anything kind of interesting to take down the kind of direction that these things are moving in?
That's a really good question. Thanks for asking it. I am less aware. I mean, I know there are some kind of, let's say, seemingly like self-declared altruistic folks in the kind of crypto blockchain world that that argue that there are possibilities to use this towards a kind of more social justice, equity building fashion, like that it would disrupt the dominant logics of the real estate industry, decentralize it, and out of this, some new freedoms would emerge. Um, so I don't know of anything really functional in this regard, and I think, to be easy to be skeptical of that kind of
Yeah.
rhetoric and logic, but I don't really um, know. But your question is making me want to look more into that
Inga, I see your
in
hand
terms
is
of
up.
the prop
I
tech
could keep
itself.
going, but I'll let
Yeah, yeah.
others. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks, Matthew. Inga.
yeah. Well, thank you, Matthew. Really appreciate the lecture. It was a lot of very clearly laid out of things we always talk about. And I want to say a few things. Number one, just maybe to what Sarah, what you just kind of asked, and a small anecdote. I just talked to a developer, and what did they tell me? They're packing up and they're going to Dubai. And I think this is to me the clear indication that the whole condos, it's a business system. They don't care about people or space or place or whatever. It's a business. So you cannot do your business here anymore because we don't let any foreign investors in who would buy this product. So then we just pack up our suitcases and go somewhere else. And I would want to know the article you had, I saw that one too, about, let's let foreign buyers in anymore. I want to know who asked for that, because I don't think it's the people who live here who want to see housing for them. I think it's the people who normally produce this kind of product, right? And we have 3,500 units empty right now downtown. So they're obviously part of that business model, which is not, and it seems like this business model, at least until now, there's no discussion about thinking that we have to cater to something else. They just feel their system is so strong. If it doesn't work here, we go somewhere else. And so my thinking is that we need not an evolution, a revolution. We need new people emerging to kind of cater to what we really need, right? The kind of housing we need. And I think it will not be them changing to that. I think there will be new people coming up, figuring out a new system. And so anyway, that's what I want to share. But I really appreciate the the way you explained all this and made it even clearer to me that this is a business model, nothing else, right? And it's kind of, we know this is an old machine, and you start to try to change any little thing, and it's not going to work because this is so close knit business model. And I wanted to say one more totally different thing about the beginning of your lecture. I really appreciate you looking into floor plans. And I was wondering if you parallel also looked how change of technology had an impact on our spatial requirements. Because when you look at the Palladian floor plan, they were all open because there was also no heating requirements. They did not have any heating. And this whole kind of layout came parallel also, or the personal space or fabric or whatever you had was also going, from my research, very parallel with innovations in how we could actually create bigger space because we were all of a sudden able to heat it and separate what we not heated. Anyway, I think it's just really interesting, and that got me to thinking, why is it that none of this business model you described is addressing our environmental concerns? And when you look at the fringes of different models where people build for people's needs, environment is right there, uh, almost with all of them, which I thought, anyway, it's just kind of more a question for you, or a more thought that
Well,
all
I'll
it,
just say I'll say really quickly, and then I see some people have their hands
yeah,
up. Like I think to your last point, I mean, can we? It just makes me ask the question. I mean, many people are asking the question.
yeah,
Can we decommodify housing, definancialize it without decarbonizing it and without decolonizing it? You know, like it would seem these things are so intertwined that it's a kind of false. And I think part of the problem with the current response to the housing crisis in Canada is that it's foregrounding a numerical financial dimension to it, which for obvious reasons around affordability, and foregrounding that so much at the expense of all the other considerations, right? And it's almost like the solution against financialization is in itself financialized. Like let's say that the provincial government's like Bill 43, it's these kind of mandates to build is all about numbers. There's nothing in it about anything other than that. Anyway, but I think the interconnection of carbon questions, climate questions, um, land justice reconciliation, and reimagining capitalism all have to happen simultaneously. Sarah, I see there's two hands up.
Yeah, Douglas, I think your hand came up first. Would you like to ask your question?
Sure. I'll try and be quick. Thank you very much, Matthew, for just a wonderful lecture. I had two quick questions or points. The last speaker also mentioned about how many of these units are held for speculation. And do you have any figures on that? Because of course that's where the actual units or houses are absolutely empty, and of course people are completely removed. But the second thing is about the date of 1980 and how much that relates to the move towards supply side economics, because the things that were put in place through Reagan and Thatcher and to a certain extent Mulroney in Canada really led to this situation where housing and all kinds of buildings could be commodified so quickly. And so I just wondered, if, it, as noted, we pretty much do have to change the economic system if we're actually going to change the way that we look at housing and make it affordable. Because as people have pointed out, if we continue with the present system, all we're doing is propping up an existing system which is completely unaffordable. So if do you have any figures though on how many units are being held for speculation in Canada or abroad?
Well, I think it's an interesting thing about, um, I think, okay, the best way I can answer this is that My understanding, and so I haven't gone and I'm relying on other researchers that have tried to get these numbers. So I myself haven't done primary research in this regard. But from what I can glean from other people's primary research is that it's dynamic, right? So like in Vancouver, they're starting to hear reports of larger numbers of vacant, like purely vacant condos than we've had in quite a while. But let's say up until the last 2 or 3 years, there didn't seem to be huge numbers of owned and totally empty condominium units. But and in some neighborhoods, like say Cole Harbor in Vancouver, I think there's been times where you sort of get up to maybe like 12% or 15%, which is, in a place where there's a housing shortage, not a small number. But in like downtown cores in Vancouver and Toronto, the number of units that are owned by people who don't live in them is massive. Some numbers in Vancouver say like 50%. So 50% of units are owned by investors. And then most of them, because of vacancy taxes and, like things falling into disrepair if they're totally not used, have chosen to rent them out and help pay their, mortgages on them. But so I would say, and so then a smaller subset let them be just empty. But all of those people are totally buying them for speculative purposes. So I don't think emptiness and speculation actually are kind of separate and mutually exclusive. They're kind of, there's a spectrum, I would say, in that regard. One thing I will say about, okay, I'm an architect, not an economist, right? So but like my understanding of the supply and demand, like the supply and demand argument, is that if there's going to be meaningful downward pressure on prices, is that by definition, we're going to have to increase vacancy. So like the fact that there are 2,000, 3,500 empty units now in like central Vancouver would seem to me being exactly what the province wants and intends, right? Because how else are you going to get the prices down? I mean, you gotta be people competing with each other to sell stuff and lower it. So interestingly, the solution to financialization as it's being construed needs to have an increased what is sometimes called natural vacancy rate, which is to say when you have very low vacancy rates, there's no downward competition, right? There's upward competition. That's kind of interesting. So I think some people say 3,500 units, we need more empty ones.
Thank you.
David.
And Douglas, I would just add too, I think there's also like a constructed like there's no information about this. We have to ask these questions because it's not allowed to be known, right? So the system is constructed supposedly to preserve the privacy of owners, but it also means that we can't, as researchers, understand the housing conditions in the economy that we're in. So I think there's also something we should be questioning there too.
If if I could just add, Sarah, I agree with you completely. We've constructed an environment which actually drives up the prices of houses. For example, REITs, which Matthew mentioned, play a powerful role, and many people don't know that REITs don't pay income tax. They've got a sweetheart deal with the Harper government to not actually pay income tax because they put out their profits as dividends, and so we've actually stacked the market against affordability.
Yeah, yeah. And they were built like that in the US too. It's the same
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
We have one more question, one hand up. David, I see.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm assuming that's your name, but
You got it.
please
Yeah,
step
yeah.
in.
Am I audible here?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. So I'd love to get into, if possible. One, I was wondering if you've observed, like specifically in like a neoliberal, maybe like North American context, like in the past 50 years, whether the economic cycle can be seen to impact decisions at like at the level of like massing and schematic. Because this is something that I've been thinking about, but it's something I more can intuit happening than see as a pattern. So I was just wondering if that's something that you've seen. And also, when you hear about all these like supply side solutions and what looks like is going to be like a kind of um, like massive de-risking of the construction or like the build out of our factory housing capacity and like supply side solutions like this kind of being brought forward with an urgency right now. So like what do you like, just like what do you think when you see that?
So your question is like in the kind of cycles of the capitalist housing markets, if there is some sort of correlation between massing strategies, building forms to those, right? Do
Yeah,
things
like
are
in
different? Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
yeah.
mean, honestly, like I mean, I I mean, it'd be interesting to do a long history of that, right? So I haven't done that. But I do think, so I've looked most closely personally at the lead up of to 2007, 2008. That's like, I had a grant where I traveled, all over Ireland, Spain, parts of the United States, because they were identified as places that physically changed a lot around the crisis. I think you can make an argument for sure that a kind of it's not it's that there was a desire, given the enthusiasm of the market, like the contagion, right? Like that, wow, like there's a lot of people making money on real estate. I would like to get in on that. There was a huge demand, that there was a kind of strong mandate to make lots and lots of units. And in the quest to make lots of units, they're almost like increments, like they're not even homes, because that there was a push to make lots of them, small usually, right? Because people would to make them smaller was to make them available to more potential investors, right? Like everyday investors.
More liquid.
Yeah. And if you wanted to invest more, you'd buy two, you'd buy three. So I think there is an argument to say it impacted unit size, right? Like, are they studios? Are they one bedroom? How big are they? And I think it impacted kind of the scale of buildings in combination with the scale of units. And I think you can derive out of that a kind of crude tendencies towards massing, like, but it's locally dependent, right? Because obviously, like, that's happening like in Dublin, out of a kind of building culture that's unique to Dublin. They were building buildings a certain way before the thrust up, and so they kind of do it within their traditions that's different than, say, in South Florida. So I don't think you can like chart one massing formula across the world, but tendencies to make lots of small scale increments of unit investment in forms that provide lots of them in that boom, and
Mhm.
then like it would be interesting, I don't like to look at other ones, and maybe people have, but I don't know a kind of long cross comparison of building forms across many booms. I mean, yeah, sorry, I'll just stop there. I know we're
Yeah,
over.
yeah, yeah, appreciate it.
Okay, I think
I think Matthew, just to add on this, I think in general you want small units because you can buy small, you can sell easier small increments. People have quicker,
Yeah.
you have more bigger pool, but also a developer makes more money with small units because the
Yeah,
percentage is higher than for a large unit. And
totally.
so, it's a double whammy why, if it's financialization of it, that you would actually go for the small units. And I think that comes first before the question, what do people really need, right?
Yes,
It is kind of more the recipe of making money rather than what people need to live.
yes.
okay. Thanks for the questions. Those were great. Thanks everyone for coming today and hearing this talk. We'll be sharing the recording with the Superstudio participants in the coming weeks. And I think that's everything for a great talk, Matthew. Thank you so much. We all, I think, really learned something today and enjoyed this. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks for
Thank you.
coming. Thanks,
Thanks.
Sarah. Bye.
Thank you.